Good morning. It's my great honor to introduce the next set of keynote speakers, both of whom I know and admire greatly, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity. First, Dr. Susan Swearer is the Willa Cather Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she's also a licensed psychologist. She co-founded and co-directs the Bullying Research Network, of which many of you are members, I assume. If not, I urge you to look into it. She also directs the Nebraska Bullying Prevention and Intervention Initiative and is co-author and co-editor of books Bullying Prevention and Intervention and a Handbook for Bullying in Schools. Dr. Swearer has authored or co-authored over 100 chapters and articles on bullying prevention and intervention, depression and anxiety among youth and young people, and she was the chair of the Research Advisory Board for Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation from 2012 to 2016, and was an invited presenter at the White House Bullying Prevention Conference in 2011 under President and First Lady Obama. So a very prestigious speaker with us today. We also have Dr. Christian Berger, who is an associate professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, where he serves as the associate chair for research and graduate studies at the School of Psychology. His research aims at understanding peer relations, in particular how social status and aggressive and pro-social behaviors are part of the adolescent peer culture. He also focuses on how contexts affect the development of positive or negative interpersonal relationships. He has published several studies addressing the effects of peer norms on aggression and bullying, and also using social network analysis to understand how positive and negative peer interactions unfold. So without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to our speakers for today.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Cherry, for the introduction, and thanks for the organizer of this forum. It has been really great to see you all, to learn more things, and to be able to discuss research and ideas for intervention. So with Susan, we prepared this talk together. We are going to talk about psychological factors or assets that can help to prevent bullying. And I want to first give you the roadmap of what we are going to do today. I'm going to first discuss some psychological factors that may be associated with bullying and try to create a theoretical framework on that. Then I'm going to frame some research that I have been conducting in the last years from this perspective, psychological perspective. Then I'm going to turn it to Susan, who's going to discuss creative methodologies to understand bullying, and then she's going to talk about applications or implications for interventions. So let me start with discussing the psychological assets in terms of bullying. And the first thing I want to say is, what's our take on bullying? How do we approach the problem? And I want to start with a kind of a controversial statement for some people, which is that aggression is an adaptive behavior. In 2007, there was a book coming out. It's called Aggression and Adaptation, The Bright Side to Dark Behavior by Pat Hawley, Todd Little, and Phil Rodkin. And they brought together literature from ethology, from sociology, psychology, education, showing the positive or adaptive side of aggressive behavior. And as you saw yesterday in Eva Romera's keynote, aggression actually is associated with popularity, with power, with hierarchies. So aggression may be functional or adaptive in terms of how you deal with social status, how you deal with peer relations, how you experience control over yourself, over your experiences, over relations, over the environment. It also has to do with how you define hierarchies, how you define dominance, and how you put yourself in the social hierarchy. And finally, it's a way of solving conflicts, how you solve conflicts with yourself, interpersonal, and with peers. However, saying that doesn't mean that aggression is good, of course. We don't want aggression to be happening in schools. And as we know, and how we have been hearing this forum over the days, there are really negative consequences associated with bullying and with aggression overall. For victims, for instance, we know that there's self-blame according to or related to bullying. We know there's a feeling of abandonment, of feeling rejected, feeling isolated from the group, a loss of confidence in others and in peer relations, which has several implications for school climate. For aggressors, they have to deal with the label of being a bad kid. So how can you integrate this label in your identity and how you develop over time? There's damage to social bonds, and there is the complicated scenario of dealing with guilt of what you're doing. For bystanders, you become or may become a secondary victim or an accomplice of aggression. So how can you locate yourself in this scenario? There's the fear of becoming a victim, and I just want to tell you that in Chile we have a national survey on school violence, and we ask kids why they don't intervene in cases of bullying. And the first motive, the first issue for not intervening is the fear of becoming a victim over time. So I don't intervene because I might become a victim too, and that has to do with the loss of confidence in peers. And finally, how to deal with mixed feelings. So whenever you see a kind of a good joke of a bully, it might be funny, but at the same time, it hurts. So how do you cope with these mixed feelings if you are not really well developed in terms of moral issues and emotions? And for the community, fear becomes the organizer of the daily experiences. So basically, you work with fear. Let me go back again to Chile. We're just discussing a law in the Congress about the right of the police to check the backpacks of students. We have a case of a school shooting a couple of weeks ago, and this discussion started to grow. And of course, checking the backpacks of students implies that we don't trust them, and we are kind of relating them as delinquents, as potential delinquents, right? So the whole context becomes a context of fear and of distrust. Again, for the community, there are feelings of vulnerability and taking care of oneself instead of the community. And as you saw in René Winster's talk yesterday, this idea of individualism and how the norms are changing over time. And finally, of course, this implies the weakening of the social bonds. So, altogether, we know that bullying and aggression in schools implies insecurity, distrust, and social anxiety. And I want to turn to Sondergaard and Kiobe's keynote yesterday. They were talking about cyberbullying and how this creates a context of insecurity, anxiety, and distrust. And my point here would be we need to work on psychological safety. So how can we create the context in which people can feel safe in this context to counteract the effect of bullying? So psychological safety is a context that comes really from organizational psychology. And has to do, I just want to focus on the first definition, the feeling that taking interpersonal risk will not result in embarrassment, ridicule, or shame. So how can you really interact with your peers, get into the social scenario without feeling fear, without feeling shame or embarrassment? And it has to do also with the opportunity for trying new things. And this is for development, it's really important. If we can have kids and adolescents trying new things in the educational context. And for that, you need to feel psychologically safe. And there's a lot of research, a lot of evidence showing the negative associations between bullying and psychological safety, right? So I'm not going to go to every studies, but we know kind of proxies of psychological safety, well-being, feeling accepted by peers, having good academic performances, they all are associated with bullying, negatively associated with bullying. And also at the school level, as you can see the last 2 points, authoritarian or security-driven measures or school policies are associated with higher bullying. Same with having explicit anti-bullying norms or policies is also associated with higher levels of truancy, the lack of these norms, right? Okay, so how these two constructs relate, psychological safety and bullying? One option is to say that bullying generates anxiety, fear, and therefore decreases in psychological safety, which would be like a traditional medical approach, right? So there's a problem and we react by feeling unsafe, and that would be the problem. The other possibility is the opposite way around. So the lack of psychological safety drives individuals to search for alternative ways to deal with anxiety, identity configuration, peer standing. So in this context, what would happen if you feel psychologically unsafe, you may try different ways to relate to others. And aggression, since its adaptive nature, may be a way to actually cope with this kind of situations. And I would like to argue for the second option. They might both work together, right? But I would say that we need to create an environment of psychological safety if we actually want to decrease and counteract bullying in schools. Okay, so how may it work for different actors? For victims, for instance, it might be a way of make them being able to search for help. we actually don't teach students how to search for help. We teach they have to be independent, right, autonomous. And it might help them to place value in other relationships, not only in the bullying relationship. For aggressors, it might help them to find alternative ways to relate to others, to enhance their social standing, to deal with social anxiety. For bystanders, it might help to being able to stand up against fear, to overcome fear, overcome abuse, no? And to build a positive moral self-concept. And I want to turn to the first keynote on Tuesday by Himmel and Sami Valley, and they were talking about this idea of morality and moral development. So we want kids to feel that they can actually help their friends, their peers, to feel morally okay, right? For reinforcers, it might help them to overcome the basking in reflected glory phenomenon, this idea of if I am close to the bullies and the popular kids, I will be popular too. There are other ways to be part of the group. And finally, for all members of the community, it might help them to work towards a desired way of being a community, not only to avoid bullying, but also to create positive environments, right? So let me turn to some studies that we have been conducting in the last years that might help me to build this argument for psychological safety as a way of counteracting bullying. And I'm going to focus on some studies on victimization, victims, on bullies, and on bystanders. So this is a study we did with Olga Cuadros a couple of years ago, and we went to see if there are specific dimensions of friendship quality that may be moderating the effect of victimization on later well-being. We know that having friends is a protective factor against being victimized by once, but also for the consequences of being victimized. And we want to focus specifically on which dimensions of friendship quality were protective for that matter. Let me first go to the overall results. We found gender differences, but the key dimension was support. So if you feel that your friends support you, the effect of being victimized is less relevant on your later well-being. And support basically is the feel of feeling safe within your peer network, within your friends, right? But we also find gender differences. For girls, disclosure, so the ability to share intimate information was also prevented, but not for boys. And when trying to interpret this, we look at the work by Niobe Way and you too in New York. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. Niobe was working with low-income, marginal boys, and their point is that these boys, when they are young, they can create really intimate and effective relationships with their peers. But when they grow up, they have to meet the standards of being a macho, so to say, a boy, right? And that implies that you cannot be vulnerable. And if you share intimate information, you become vulnerable. So you lose the ability to create high-quality relationships and high-quality friendships. Another paper that just came out, we focus on victimized adolescents, and we want to see who they look after as friends, so who they nominate as friends. And we had 3 research questions here. One was to test the idea of homophily, the idea that victims come together as friends. They search for each other to share the experience of being victimized. Our second question was, okay, do they look for friends who can protect them by means of being prosocial or by means of being aggressive? Because they have power, they can protect us, kind of the jail or the prison culture, right? And the last question was, is victimization really contagious? So if you actually become friend of a victim, will you become victimized over time too? And for this, we use social network analysis. I'm not going to take all the, all the numbers here, just want to focus on 3 things. We didn't find any homophily effect, so victims do not hang out together as friends, right? So they don't share this experience. They are not tied to each other. Second, we found victims search for prosocial peers as friends, which is kind of encouraging. They don't look for aggressive friends, they look for prosocial friends. And of course, that means they feel secure and safe when they look for this type of peers in the classroom. And finally, we didn't find any contagion effect. So if you are a friend of a victim, you won't become victimized over time. And again, as I told you before, in our survey in Chile, this is the main motive for not intervening. And here we're finding evidence that actually that's not the case. You can intervene without the fear of becoming victimized over time. And we need to inform this to the community. So let me now move to aggressors. And this is a qualitative study that we did a couple of last year, and it's under review. And I wanted to bring this in because we usually don't see qualitative research in this area, right? And I think it's really important to get to this more subjective experiences. And here we ask, so what about aggressors? Do they feel safe too in their peer relationships? And for this, we focus on the most aggressive and popular kids in our study. So those were selected by being one standard deviation above the mean, both in aggression and popularity. And we conducted in-depth interviews and analysis this to run the theory. And this is our finding, and we just want to focus on two things. First is how they feel about themselves as being friends from their peers. And it's basically really ambivalent, and they feel vulnerable. And what they report, they told us is that they use aggression as self-defense, because they have the feeling that they are threatened by the possibility of being mocked or hurt or teased by their peers. And they create this argument that since they are popular, they are envied by their peers. And since they are envied by their peers, they might be betrayed, right? And they might be teased. So they have to use aggression as a way to detach from their friends. And of course, the implication of this is that they cannot have truly qualitative, high-quality friendship with their peers. And then we asked them, so what do you talk about with your friends? And what you don't talk about with your friends, and why, right? And what they said is that they didn't share any relevant personal information, because sharing relevant information or intimate information is a liability. If they share this information, they might become vulnerable, because this information may be used against them. So they don't share intimate information, and you can think the implications of that for development over time, if you cannot share information and core aspects of your life with your peers, right? So finally, bystanders. How do we deal with bystanders? And this is a study we developed with Paul Petit in Boston College, and Julio Dantas, who works in an NGO, kind of parallel of GLSEN in the States for LGBT youth. And we focus on homophobic bullying because, I'm not sure how it's in here, but this in Chile is a really pervasive and normative problem in schools. And if we want to cope, to deal with homophobic bullying, we first have to identify it, to make kids to report it, and for that we have to visualize it, to get in the whole community to say this is a problem, and to build trust on teachers and school staff. And in this study, we focus on the reporting of homophobic bullying. And this is the whole community, not only LGBT youth, but also the whole student body in schools. So what predicts reporting homophobic bullying? First, trusting in teachers and staff. If students trust in teachers and staff when they face homophobic bullying situations, they will report it, which is kind of makes sense. What predicts this trust? There are two factors. One is not hearing homophobic comments by school staff and teachers. And when we see the overall survey, it's impressive that around 60% of students say they hear on a day-to-day basis, they hear homophobic comments, remarks, and jokes from their teachers. So of course this creates a sense of unsafety, and therefore they don't report bullying. By the other hand, if teachers and staff have intervened previously in situations of homophobic bullying, they will trust them and again report it. But then we move to the school-wide level, and we found that schools in which there is a perception of a specific anti-LGBT bullying policy, if that's the case, that implies that teachers will not be able to do jokes or comments or remarks, homophobic remarks. And that in turn will create a context of safety, trust, and confidence, which in turn predicts reporting. So again, we are creating an environment of safety for all the students by, in this case, working at the school level, creating policies, right? Let me return to my last study I want to present to you. This is an intervention that we have been developing over the last 4 years. It's called Priscilla Co, which stands for Prosocial, Civic, and Social Cohesion. This was developed first in Italy by Caprara and colleagues, and then was also implemented in Colombia, and now we brought it to Chile a couple of years ago. And with this intervention, we work with 7th graders, trying to promote prosocial behavior among them with the goal of promoting social cohesion, which is not against bullying, it's the opposite. It's creating good, safe environments. And this is an experimental random design with our control and intervention group. We use, again, social network analysis, and here Diego Palacios is working on this analysis. What we do is we try to predict rejection from other networks, in this case, aggressive and victimization networks. So basically, we ask kids, who do you think is aggressive? Who do you think is victimized? And if that predicts over time, nominating him or her as disliked or rejected. And again, only the main findings here, we found that in intervention classrooms compared to control classrooms, adolescents who were considered as victims by the peers were less disliked by those same peers. So if I say, for instance, that Susan is a victim, I won't dislike her as much as if we were in a control group. Same with aggressors, and this is really interesting. We find the same effect. So if adolescents who were considered as aggressive by their peers were also less disliked over time by those same peers. And our interpretation of this is that these classrooms are much more inclusive. So you can actually be really against aggression, but you're not against the person who is aggressive. And you can separate the person from the behavior, which is really important for creating environments. So let me just move to an overall conclusion of the first part in my talk. Psychological safety seems to be a resource for counteracting bullying. For victims, it may allow them to search for nurturing peers to cope with negative outcomes associated to victimization. For bullies, it may lower their experiences of vulnerability, so allowing them to explore alternative ways to relate to their peers. For bystanders, they may create confidence in their social context and allow them to stand against abuse and report abuse. And for the community, it might help them to build trust and nurturing relationships. And we can do this in different ecological levels. At the individual level, for instance, by social emotional learning, at the dyadic level, by fostering friendship, at the network, by creating classrooms, environment more nurturing, and at the school, for instance, with policies, with after-school programs, and other initiatives. So I'm going to turn to Susan now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great job. Well, good morning. It's great to be here. I want to thank the World Anti-Bullying Forum for inviting me to talk, and to my co-presenter, Christian. We had a really nice time pulling this together. I also want to thank my graduate students at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. They certainly do a lot of work in our lab, like many of you graduate students in this room. And specifically, I want to thank one of my grad students, Zach Myers. Some of these data that I'm going to be talking about are from his dissertation and have also been previously published in the International Journal of Technoethics, which you might not have known exists. I'm also going to talk about unique ways of translating our research, because I think that's really important, that we think about how do we translate the research that we do at our universities and our labs and get the information to people on the ground. So part of my work has been with Born This Way Foundation, and we've been trying to think of unique strategies for disseminating our research knowledge, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of my remarks. And then also to encourage you, if you're not a member of the Bullying Research Network, to consider asking to join the network. One of the ways we try to disseminate research in this area worldwide is we post research articles every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And if you remember from Peter Smith's talk, just the exponential numbers of publications in bullying is stunning. So when we thought, oh, could we find 3 articles a week, we actually are able to find 3 articles a week. And if you remember, Peter said 4 articles a day are being published in this area. So there's just been such a proliferation of research in bullying prevention and intervention. I'm going to talk about the Born Brave mixed methods study very briefly, talk about some of the results from this study, and then I'm going to specifically tie it to intervention work that we've been doing in Nebraska. So this study was based on social cognitive theory that other people have talked about at this forum, and also the trans-theoretical model of change. And so it was a planned missing data, mixed methods research design. I'm happy to talk about the pros and cons of this design. It was certainly challenging. And our goal was to build a model of youth empowerment and youth engagement. And so what are the factors that contribute to youth empowerment and youth engagement? And then basically the foundation's important question is, what are the conditions needed to empower youth to create a kinder and braver world? And so again, very briefly, it's an online survey methodology through Qualtrics. Participants get to the survey through the Born This Way Foundation website. We recruit through concert tours, which is a kind of a unique sample, and you'll see some of the demographics. The Born This Way website, Twitter, and Facebook. We've collected data from 2012. We're currently in the 4th study. And so we have data from over 10,000 youth and young adults who have completed these surveys. Our focal construct is kindness and bravery, and then we have some validity measures around kindness and bravery. We're also interested in bullying experiences and victimization and other factors related to creating a kinder and braver world. I'm going to go through the timeline just from the first study. We've modeled the second and third study after the first study, and actually our demographics are surprisingly pretty similar as well. So we initially recruit through the concert. So the first study was through the Born This Way ball, and then that's how we initially advertised the research, kind of get participants. And then we did a mixed methods design. So in the first study, we conducted interviews in New York, Los Angeles, Kansas, and Nebraska in order to really try to capture these constructs of kindness and bravery and what inhibits kindness and bravery and what promotes kindness and bravery. So for the 3 studies, this has generally been our model. Our demographics are pretty diverse. So we have a youth survey, ages 13 to 19, and then a young adult survey to 25, age 25. In the majority of these studies, about half of the participants live in the US, half are from other countries. 62% white, 25% Latinx, 12% Asian, other races. The majority are female, 52%, 43% male, 4% transgender or genderqueer. And then in terms of sexual orientation, it's a very diverse sample, and it has been across the 3 studies, and presumably, or not presumably, because of mostly Lady Gaga's demographics, we have a very diverse sample in terms of sexual orientation. So the question that we were interested in, and this is from one of my students' dissertations, was do perceptions of coping moderate the relationship between victimization experiences, internalizing symptomatology? So this ties into the study that Christian presented on in terms of support. And so I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to move into talking about working with what Christina Samavali called the challenging youth in our work. So this data set was over 4,000 youth and young adults. You can see the mean age, 50% were college students, 27% identified as heterosexual, 48% as female, 66% Caucasian, from 115 different countries, 46% were from the US. Our top next 3 countries are Brazil, Mexico, and then the different European countries. The surveys are all in English, but we do have a separate survey of 500 participants who have taken the survey in Spanish. So these data were part of the Born Brave Experiences study. In this third study, we also recruited through Life is Good Corporation, who provided incentives for participating in the study. Separate surveys accessed through the Born This Way Foundation website. So we were interested in basically poly-victimization, and I'll talk about how we constructed that. So we collected data on traditional victimization, cyberbullying victimization. We adapted Peter Smith's cyberbullying questionnaire. We collected data on depression, anxiety, coping, and perceived social support. And so what I think is really interesting as we think about cyberbullying, and particularly for cyberbullying researchers, in this sample, only 5% of the sample were cyber victims only. So I think this really kind of, argues for us to think about when we're assessing cyberbullying, we want to make sure we're also assessing other forms of victimization as well. And so what we were specifically interested in was this poly-victimization group. So students who experience verbal bullying, physical bullying, relational bullying, in addition to cyberbullying. And so in terms of looking at some of these findings in terms of psychopathology, you can see that poly-victimization is not great in terms of anxiety. And so for both youth and young adults, poly-victimization, individuals who experience multiple forms of victimization reported higher levels of anxiety. And again, not surprising, I kind of think of this as more is worse. So the more different ways you're victimized, the worse, your psychological outcomes. And the same findings for depression. So again, more is worse, and it makes sense if people are experiencing multiple forms of depression that could be linked to depression and anxiety. And so the majority of cyberbullied youth experienced co-occurring traditional victimization, and then the poly victims had more severe internalizing problems, and their anxiety and depression scores fell in the severe and moderate ranges. So in terms of just generally other findings, kind of linking some of this work to Christian's work on coping, friend support, and family support predicted lower depression. Coping and friend support predicted lower anxiety for youth, while coping alone contributed to lower anxiety for young adults. Youth with higher perceptions of friend support experienced less anxiety and depression, and for both youth and young adults, higher perceptions of family support were associated with lower depressive symptomatology. And the main point, though, that I want to make is that at the clinical levels of depression and anxiety, support did not moderate victimization experiences. So certainly coping and support are really important constructs, but when we think about youth who are experiencing significant internalizing and externalizing symptomatology, support is not enough. So it's like a necessary but insufficient condition to really help these youth cope with their experiences. So that kind of moves me into thinking about, okay, how do we work with these difficult youth or challenging youth? Youth who, certainly whole school approaches are extremely important, but there are going to be some youth who are not going to be impacted by some of those broader programs. And so in our work, we've thought about, okay, if you think about the research and the fact that maybe 8 to 10% of students in any given school building are the ones who are perpetrating the bullying behaviors, you can do the math. It's not a huge number of students. Why not work directly with those students? And so that's what we've developed over the past 15 years. It's an individualized cognitive behavioral intervention for youth who bully other youth. And we call this a Tier 1 intervention, so it's an individualized intervention. And a little background about this intervention. So I was approached years ago by a school principal who said, when kids bully other kids and they get in trouble, our policy is they go to in-school suspension, they sit in a room, for 3 to 4 hours. Can you design something that's better than them sitting in the room, for 3 to 4 hours? So I thought, well, that's a really high bar, but I think I can do something about that. So we designed an intervention that was definitely better than sitting in a room alone for 3 to 4 hours, or a room with a proctor or a paraprofessional for 3 to 4 hours. And in a nutshell, the intervention is an hour of assessment, and so we assess constructs that are related to bullying and victimization, like depression, anxiety, self-concept, callous unemotional traits, empathy, and we kind of do that to kind of create a picture of this student. Then, based on those data, the interventionist will do cognitive restructuring activities, role-playing. Based on the referral, we tailor the cognitive behavioral intervention component of the intervention. And then we do a follow-up meeting that takes place 2 to 3 weeks after the intervention. That includes school personnel, the parent, the student, and getting everybody together. And we generate a treatment report, and we have a bank of recommendations based on the data. So I think some interesting points. When the study was first designed, we thought we would have a group of parents who would say, I'm fine with my son or daughter being suspended. I don't want them to go through therapy because there's a stigma about therapy. So I think interestingly, in the 15 years of doing this study, no parent has chosen the suspension option. So from a research perspective, it kind of blew my comparison group. But I think from perspective of how parents want schools to help their children, I think that's a really important point, that no parent has ever said, I don't want my child to go through this intervention. The other point that I think is really important is that in the 15 years of doing this intervention project, we've never had a student who has never scored at a significant level on any of these measures. So something always shows up. And I think that's really interesting if we think about what are some of the underlying psychological mechanisms that might be driving bullying behavior. So there's always something. So I feel like we always have something to talk about. And just kind of, flashbacking a long time ago, when I was in graduate school, my dissertation research was on the comorbidity of depression and conduct disorder in adolescents. And I was really motivated by a 1983 paper by Joachim Puzantik, who showed that when you worked with conduct disordered boys who also had a comorbid depressive disorder, and you treated the depressive disorder, the conduct disorder behaviors went away without specifically treating, the conduct behavior. So that's kind of how I got into this work, was thinking about, okay, the comorbidity of depression and conduct disorder, the comorbidity of conduct disorder and anxiety are really interesting to me. And, how do we think about youth with externalizing problems who also have internalizing problems? And so partly that's, kind of our goal with this intervention. So we have office referral data, which, as everyone knows, are messy, not great data, but it's kind of the best we have right now. So when we look at office referrals pre and post intervention, we see that this affects these kids. We also have had some differences in terms of psychopathology, so I'm going to talk briefly about that and then kind of wrap up our presentation. So when we look at anxiety, you can see, again, this is kind of the more is worse point, that bully victims have higher total anxiety scores and physical anxiety scores and social anxiety. And I think there's so much work that needs to be done in this area. If you think about the fact that there are 9 anxiety disorders that can be diagnosed in children and adolescents, we know so little about these nuances across the different anxiety disorders and involvement in bullying and victimization. And so, again, I think one take-home from this slide is that bully victims, who I think are kind of a misunderstood group of youth involved in the bullying dynamic, score higher on anxiety. When we look at cognitive distortions, which is another factor that we assess, we did a kind of smaller sub-study with some kids who went through this intervention and looked at their pre and post cognitive distortion scores, and as you can see, 2 to 3 weeks post-intervention, their cognitive distortions were rated them lower than pre-intervention. So again, I think we're kind of getting at something here when we're trying to help these kids restructure their thinking and some of their justifications for engaging in bullying behaviors. We have some gender differences. Again, I think when we think about some of our interventions, some of them do kind of target some gender differences, but some don't. And I think, it's important. Christian's study also showed some gender differences, and I think we need to kind of think about that. Again, I think the door is wide open when we think about gender identity in transgender youth and how very little we know about those youth. So again, we can all study all of these issues, forever. But I think gender and thinking about how gender impacts involvement in bullying and victimization is really important. And then in terms of, just thinking about clinical levels of depression and anxiety, so these are all kids are referred for, consistent problems with bully perpetrating. And, we have, 17% of our males had elevated anxiety scores, 16% of females, and 14% had elevated depression scores. And so to me, I can't think about bullying involvement without thinking about mental health. And again, as Christian talked about, do mental health issues come first and then the bullying, or the bullying happens and then the mental health issues? And the reality is it's both. But I think it's really critical that we assess cognitive and psychological functioning when we're working with youth who are involved in bullying, and to recognize that multiple forms of victimization, so polyvictimization, and the youth who both bully others and who are victimized are at great risk for significant mental health issues. So kind of how do we wrap up, Christian's comments and my comments? We want to really make several points. One is when we're looking at psychological functioning, it doesn't mean that context isn't critical. School is critical, family is critical, the peer group is critical. So these things work together, much as the social ecological model, shows us. Not every intervention is going to fit every individual. And again, I think that's a big challenge for schools, is to think about, okay, what interventions are we implementing, and who's it hitting? So what's the dosage effect, and what's working for whom under what conditions? And again, there's so many alternatives or research options for future research. We also need to think outside the box in terms of creative methodologies. So mixed methods research, qualitative interviews, focus groups, really digging into the weeds of this very complex social problem. We also need to consider unique partnerships. I really think, challenge us to think about working with foundations, governmental agencies. Do we disseminate, research through blogs, websites? How are youth or how are individuals getting their information? Twitter. So really thinking about some interesting alternative ways to, push out all of this great research that people are doing. And then I think finally we need to promote kindness, bravery, and positive psychological functioning if we're going to eradicate bullying behaviors. So thank you all very much. Look at that.
We're very fortunate to have some time for interaction with our presenters, Dr. Swearer and Berger. So we have someone with a microphone. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, let us know.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for these great presentations. This is a question for Christian. How do you promote this safety psychology, like in actions in the schools? What can you do to promote it?
Well, we're doing three different things. One is training at the individual level, like social emotional learning skills and promoting empathy and self-regulation. That's one part. The second part, I would say, is training teachers. Teachers are key actors in here, and we have to train teachers not only in coping with bullying situations, but creating safe environments and positive relationships. And the third part has to do with the school level interventions. For instance, we're studying after-school programs, and we found that we are assessing the same kids in schools and after-school programs. And when we use pre-nominations procedure, you see that kids who are nominated as aggressive and bullies in schools, there's no nomination for aggression in after-school programs. So what we're seeing there is that aggression is functional within the classroom, but not in other contexts. They're the same kids. So what we're thinking is that we should learn what's happening, what kind of peer processes are happening in those contexts, and try to bring them to the classroom. And that has to do with pedagogical interventions and how you understand knowledge and how you construct the classroom experiences. So I would at least focus on these three different levels.
Okay. Thank you.
I see another hand.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting part of the conference. I was wondering, very curious about, this goes for Christian, how do you get those who are measured as high on aggression to come to interviews about being high on aggression? How do you get them?
Can you elaborate more on your question? How do
you get to speak to those boys who, what do you ask them to talk about? How do you get them to the interviews? Because I think that's how to speak with those who are characterized as bullies.
Well, we didn't start talking to them by kind of identifying as our aggressors. We didn't focus on that. We focus on them as kind of key actors, relevant actors in the peer culture. Well, our starting point wasn't that they're aggressive. No, that wasn't the starting of the conversation. So we tried to not follow the stigma of being aggressive, and we start from there in the discussion. Yeah.
If I can jump in too, in terms of answering that. So for our students who are referred, they're referred for aggressive behavior and they know they're referred for aggressive behavior, but the interventionist is trained to talk to them in a very non-judgmental, solution-focused way. So they'll start out right away saying, you're not in trouble. We're interested in helping you, figure out other ways of acting so you don't continue to get in trouble. And so that kind of changes it, and they become much more open and willing to talk about their experiences.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, Christian. This question is for you, based on the first question. Do you think there is a relation between the education systems and the bullying? I mean, because of your first answer, maybe the education system with all this competitiveness makes the students more close, to this kind of behavior. That's the first part of the question. The second, there exists a correlation between the level of the students, their marks, and the level of bullying. I mean, the better students are more bullies, or maybe they are not. Well, we see a lot of films, United States films, where usually the bullies are not the smartest, usually. So maybe this bullying is related to a way to complete some part of their personality, their character. They can't afford at the school, This is like two questions, but based on what you answer first.
Sure, I would say we have heard during the forum a lot of different perspectives from different countries, and of course the educational system are quite different. We just published a paper in which we compare classrooms that are organized by grades. So you put the good students together and the bad students together, so to say, by performance, and we found complete different pre-relations within those classrooms. And when you mix them all together, you find better friendships and higher quality friendship. And when you create these separate worlds, you actually create more competition. And of course, competition then turns into social competition. But then, what happens within the peer group, it's resembling what is happening in society. So if you see competition at the political level, at the economical level, you will see that just being resembled in different levels of the group. And about your second question, I would say that good performing students are much adapted to what teachers are expecting from them. I wouldn't say that they are less or more aggressive. I wouldn't put aggression on that matter, but I would think that they are more adapted, so they can cope with different experiences in a different way. If you think aggression is a way of coping with frustration, with anxiety, sure, if they are not adapted, they might be more aggressive. But I wouldn't put aggression in the person. I would put aggression in the interface with the context. I'm not sure if you, Susan, want to add something to that.
I mean, I think the only thing that comes to mind is that there's such variability across schools and across classrooms, across, countries and states. And I think, if I go back to the individual intervention that we do, some there's no kind of connection in terms of high-performing students, low-performing students. But when we have low-performing students, then certainly some of our recommendations are how to help that student academically, hypothesizing that that student might be frustrated because they're not doing well academically. But then our recommendations always include, tutoring or some extra support. And so with the idea that, and if we look at the literature on conduct disorder behavior and reading problems, the idea that if you help those students academically, they feel better, they have more self-efficacy about their academic performance, they might be less likely, to engage in aggressive behavior.
This is a very general question, so any of you can answer. I was just wondering, the kids who are really troubled, aggressive behavior or victims, does this general approach of whole school approach or anything, because usually all our bullying programs are for the whole school. So do you really think it works for the kids who are really in need of help, especially this psychological help? So do you think when we are designing, because I'm just beginning this bullying research, so whenever we are designing a bullying program, do you really think we should incorporate special services as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. I think that whole school approaches are incredibly critical. I think, school climate is critical, and having a positive climate and whatever adults and students can do in schools to create that positive climate is really critical. But as I mentioned, there's also a dosage effect. And so I think that when we think about our interventions, and in the US, we think about a tiered model, tier 3, tier 2, tier 1, I think you have to have all tiers. So I think you have to have whole school approaches. I think you have to have, classroom interventions, small group interventions, thinking about peer structural interventions. But I think you also have to have the individual interventions. Some schools aren't equipped to do that. And so I think when we think about, mental health services in schools or in communities, what I always encourage schools and school personnel to think about is, okay, if we don't have a mental health provider in our school, then can we partner with mental health providers in the community? So for example, in my community, we have a community mental health center, and we have therapists who come into the schools. So I think really thinking creatively about how do you get those mental health services is really important. But I think they need to be there.
Yeah. And I would like to add to this what Christina Samueli was saying on Tuesday, and the work by guys Hutzing, I don't know how to say the last name, but you know him. This healthy context paradox, in which whenever you create these good environments, there are some kids who are actually worse in those contexts. And it has to do with these individual differences. So whenever you have this whole school approach, you need to understand that the effect of these programs are quite different for different people within the context. So you need these tailored interventions and different tier level interventions.
So I also have this experience in Indian schools. So whenever I was doing this whole school approach, girls especially were coming separately to me for asking for help. So this kind of whole school approach, I thought they just started to know that they have help, but they used to personally come. So I really thought, because your article, Susan, this 3-tier, I read before I started doing my intervention program, that really helped me though. So yeah, because we are not having that much funding in Indian schools that we need to have special services. So I always think whether how to creatively make a whole school approach for especially schools who don't have funding for special services.
So what you could do, you could think about the whole school approach, and then given the gender issues, you could think about tier 2 being gendered. So you might have programs for girls and programs for boys. Yeah.
Time for one last question. I know you need to move on.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentations. One thing you mentioned was the importance of promoting kindness and bravery, and I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on how we do that. What are some of the successful strategies for promoting kindness and bravery?
Sure. So I'm a big fan of the Random Acts of Kindness Foundation. So if you go to the Random Acts of Kindness Foundation website, they have free curricula that teachers can download and just great suggestions. And so a lot of it, I think, is messaging and also modeling, of course. So adults modeling, pro-social behaviors. We are also creating a measure of kindness and bravery, which, at the outset, I thought, oh, how hard can that be? Well, it's a lot harder than I thought it would be. So we're in our 4th iteration of scale development for a measure of kindness and bravery. So I'm interested in that from an assessment position, but also then just for how do we promote that. And so we talk with kids about, what does kindness look like, bravery, how do you stand up for people, who might be being picked on. And so I think a lot of it is adults using that language, and then also strategies or curricula like Random Acts of Kindness Foundation, and just having that be the tone in the school, kind of going back to your question about, kind of how do we create a whole school environment of respect, kindness, and bravery. And I'm happy to talk in more detail.
If I can just mention
Absolutely.
one thing, there's a organization, a nonprofit in Tucson, Arizona called Ben's Bells, that's dedicated to spreading kindness in schools and elsewhere in communities. I would encourage you to look at their website as well, Ben's Bells.
Yeah, they're terrific.
And with that, have a wonderful break and enjoy the rest of the conference.